Just before I introduce Brian, I think I'd like to mark the occasion of a Galway Arts Festival event where the cast is entirely engineers. This is hopefully a first, but hopefully not the last. So before I go any further, I'd just like to introduce our speaker today, Brian O'Gallagher, who's the director of the MaREI Research Centre. MaREI is the research centre for energy, climate and marine research in Ireland. He's the Professor of Energy Engineering at UCC, and he leads MaREI's research on building and using energy systems models that have underpinned Irish and EU energy and climate mitigation policies and energy company strategies. He's also MaREI's educational public engagement champion and has received Science Foundation Ireland's Best International Engagement Award for 2020. He is the chair of the International Energy Agency Technology Collaboration Programme on Energy Systems Modelling and an elected fellow of the Irish Academy of Engineering. And he has a BSc from TCD and a PhD from UCC. So, Brian, you're very welcome to Galway.
Thank you, Rory. Delighted to be here.
Great. So before we get started, before I get started with questioning Brian, I'd like to question you, our audience, today. And I have a couple of questions just to help us set the scene here. So it was announced a number of months ago that Ireland had achieved 43% electricity coming from zero carbon renewable sources last year, which was quite an achievement. That was 43% of electricity. What I'd like to ask the audience, and a show of hands for some options here, is what percentage of the overall energy use in Ireland today is electricity? Okay, so we think of energy use as being electricity to run the lights, etc., but there's also transport fuel and heating fuel. So what percentage is electricity? Your options are 20%, 50%, or 80%. So can I get a show of hands for 20%? Okay. Show of hands for 50%. And a show of hands for 80% electricity. Okay, no one thinks we're 80% electrified. The answer is about 20%. Okay, so the majority seem to be on the money for that. Now, overall, so with that 43% in electricity, let's think overall. What percentage of Ireland's overall energy is coming from renewables? So of all the energy we use every year, what comes from renewables? So is it 12%, 24%, or 36%? Hands up for 12. Hands up for 24. Hands up for 36. The 12% have it. I think we should start not making the lowest number the right one. Very good. Okay, so questions for you, Brian. I guess I'd like to get a sense for how you started off doing what you're doing. What was your journey into energy research?
Well, firstly, I'm delighted to be here, and I do look forward to hearing questions from yourself, Rory, but also that we'll have an opportunity to hear questions from the audience. In terms of my journey, it would have started in, I suppose, 1990. I had just finished a course in Dublin in applied sciences, and I was wondering what to do. And I had a number of ideas in my head. Go on the Rainbow Warrior with Greenpeace on the ocean seas, and that was one thought at the time. And another was to see. I had a very strong interest in nuclear physics, actually, from my college days. You know, what are the fundamental particles of which we're made? So I spent 6 months in a research center in Germany on nuclear physics, and I realized after that was certainly what I didn't want to do anymore. It was fascinating in terms of the theoretical aspects, but I was more drawn towards problem solving, and the environment was a particular area I wanted to focus on. So after that, I started looking around the universities in Ireland to see what kind of research was being done on different forms of renewable energy. And it was quite little, actually, at the time. And when I looked at wind energy, a lot of the physics, a lot of the fundamentals were understood. So I was drawn to wave energy, where Ireland has a huge resource, huge capacity, but there wasn't much activity in that area. So I contacted a team in UCC, and I came down to do a master's in ocean wave energy. And that turned into a PhD. And after that finished, it was clear to me that it was a fascinating topic, but nobody was listening. That was the sense I had at the time. So in 1995, I joined Ireland was setting up a renewable energy information office to try and gather information on renewable sources of energy and share it with the policy system, with the industry, and with citizens. So I managed that for 3 years. And then I came back to the university and I started focusing on specific aspects of research to tackle the challenges associated with increasing our renewable energy supply. And from that, it evolved into a wider focus, not just on renewable energy, but the whole energy system, looking at where we use energy, why we use energy, and some of the inertia, some of the blockages to change. And that's what brought me to where I am today.
Yeah. So that really leads me to my next question for you. Is you talked about where we use energy, why we use energy. What are the answers to that? Why does energy matter in society? Why should people care about it?
I suppose there's two reasons. We've over many years we use more and more energy for the things that we do. We're not necessarily aware that we're using energy because we're doing things that consume energy. So previously we would have walked, now we drive. We have in a place like this, we have lighting, we have microphones, we have cameras. There's so much of what we do that actually has a consequence, that it uses increasing amounts of energy. And this is not just in Ireland, but globally. So energy use, energy consumption has increased significantly over the last number of years. And that's having a number of significant negative environmental impacts because most of the energy we use comes from fossil fuels, comes from burning fossil fuels that are effectively carbon-based. And then when we burn them, that carbon mixes with oxygen and releases carbon dioxide, which is causing global warming. And we had the international scientific report just a few weeks ago highlighting how much damage we are causing and the consequences of that. So we're consuming increasing amounts of energy, and that's having a significant negative environmental impact, of which climate change is only one. Air pollution is another significant negative impact associated with the way we use energy.
So in terms of here in Ireland, what's been our energy story? What's been our pathway in energy in Ireland?
I suppose if you look back at we did a reflective piece with this being the 100 years centenary reflections back on a century since the rising in 1916 and then since independence. And it's quite interesting to look at. I was looking at the writings of Michael Collins, and he had a vision for associated with Ireland's independence with a level of energy independence. And he drew on some writings from the first president of UCC, who wrote a report on the industrial resources of Ireland in 1847. Now, he wrote it just at the time that the famine was rampant. So the ability to develop an industrial strategy, was delayed significantly. But with independence, one of the things that came about was the establishment of the Ordnacrusha hydropower plant, and building on that, the development of the initial development of the electricity network of Ireland, and that brought significant benefits to people that we're still realizing today. And then in the 50s and 60s, there was a significant increase with the rural electrification scheme. So building on a number of smaller hydropower plants and peat-fired stations, bringing electricity essentially to the nation. So that's the electricity story. And then in terms of heating and transport, we've used indigenous peat and coal for many years for heating. We discovered natural gas off the southwest coast of Kinsale in the late 1970s, which coincided with the oil crisis when there was a significant constraints in terms of accessing oil. So that allowed us to increase the amount of natural gas we could use, and we developed a pipeline system to deliver that natural gas, initially to Dublin, from Cork to Dublin, and then subsequently further around the country. And then I suppose the most recent addition to that was in Corrib, the Corrib find in terms of natural gas. And that highlights a specific challenge in terms of the relationship between energy infrastructure and citizen rights in the areas where that infrastructure is. So there are huge benefits that we've got from our energy system, and then there are pinch points where there are challenges. And one of the pinch points is on the environmental impacts that I mentioned. Another is this interplay between what might be seen as for the collective good, how that impacts on people locally.
That's definitely something I want to touch on at a point later on. But you know, you've highlighted the benefits there, and you know, people certainly in the nation's imagination, Ardnacrusha was like a monumental achievement. And I visited Ardnacrusha maybe it was just before the lockdown actually, and they do an amazing tour there.
They do.
But they highlighted that at the time it was built, Ardnacrusha provided 98% of Ireland's electricity.
Yes.
And now it provides 2%.
Yes.
And Ardnacrusha hasn't shrunk.
Yes.
But Ireland's grown.
Yeah.
So it's really fascinating to see. So you talked about energy use being linked to benefits and electrification and prosperity and increased mobility. So what's the problem with this?
The main problem is well, there are a number of problems. The main problem we see in Ireland are the environmental impacts. Globally, there are also structural and systemic problems. I mean, we've had significant amount of global conflict associated with access to oil, for example. So internationally, there are huge challenges, and you see tensions in the Middle East, in Nigeria, around the control of and distribution and access to those oil resources. And in terms of what we see here is the biggest challenge, I think, here is associated with the environmental impacts. There are other, and that's across the board, that environmental. There are also issues of inequality. So there's about a quarter of our households are currently in receipt of fuel allowance. And the scale of energy poverty is generally a kind of a blind spot in this country. And when we look at solutions to try and move to change our energy system, a lot of times that blind spot is hidden, you know, and that's problematic for those people, of course, who are experiencing energy poverty, but it's also problematic for our ability to actually meet our ambitions. If we want to change, if we have a number of blind spots, which we do. I mean, another blind spot is the role of heat and the volume of energy associated with heat, and how little we've done there. So those are kind of a number of the challenges, some international and some national, and some within segments nationally.
Yeah. So it's certainly, you know, it seems to my mind in the public is now aware of the environmental challenges around energy use, and I think you know, something I'd like to probe you on later is how we get action to happen, how we can motivate action. But worldwide, you know, getting off fossil fuels, getting off carbon, what has been the experience on a sort of a global basis? Just putting Ireland aside for a moment.
Well, you mentioned the fact that, you know, Ardnacrusha was our, you know, we were nearly 100% renewable electricity 100 years ago, and now Ardnacrusha represents 2% of our electricity. We see a similar kind of trend globally. So if we look at energy end use, about 80% of energy used globally is from fossil fuels, including fossil fuel generated electricity. And if you look at 10 years ago, it was 80%. So we've had a significant growth in renewable energy, but we've had a significant growth also in energy consumption. So And this is really part of the challenge, because sometimes when we talk about emissions reduction, we focus on one thing, you know, like we need to further increase the amount of wind energy, and it ends up being a kind of almost a silver bullet, and we can lose sight of the fact that, well, hang on a sec, last winter was cold, so we used a lot more oil and gas for heating. Or we opened up a new motorway and we've suddenly got more cars on the road. And so looking at pieces of either the solution space or pieces of the problem is a challenge, because we can lose sight of the bigger picture. So globally, we've seen significant growth in renewable energy in that 10-year period, but it hasn't yet sort of knocked a dent out of the fact that 80% of our energy is still from fossil fuels, and it's a bigger amount of energy. So our emissions, so while our renewable energy has been growing internationally, our emissions have also been growing internationally.
Yeah. I read there recently that car sales in the US average around 17 million cars a year.
Yes.
In China, they're upwards of 28 million.
Yeah.
And this is, you know, it's almost as if, you know, the prosperity, the development that increased fossil fuel use contributed to is obviously, it's increasing the size of the pie. So even renewables piece is growing. The pie is getting bigger.
Yeah. And we also see trends within that, because with one of the blind spots is within the car sales, like what cars are being bought. So we are seeing an increase in electric vehicles, which is great, but we're also seeing an increase in gas guzzlers. You know, SUVs, the really and inefficient SUVs, particularly in the States, but not only in the States. Also, we're seeing that in Europe. So we have this linkage, if you like, between increased prosperity, which is a great thing, but having a negative environmental impact through the increase in consumption. And that's one of the key challenges, actually, the growth in consumption.
Absolutely. I'm definitely going to be targeting that for a question later on. So, you know, you touched on some of the progress Ireland has made, but how have we done on, you know, we've got targets that are translated into Irish law from the EU. We had Kyoto targets. How has Ireland done in meeting these targets in recent years?
We've done very well in some individual areas, and we've done very poor overall. That would be the simple way of characterizing it. If you look at electricity, for example, I was comparing our electricity with, I think it was 20 years ago, and we have a 40% increase in electricity and a 40% reduction in the emissions associated with electricity. Right. And that's a phenomenal achievement, and it's been driven by a number of things. One is the increased use of natural gas power plants, particularly in the early noughties,
as opposed to
which were more efficient than oil and coal and peat. And so they're 55% efficient, whereas the peat, oil, and coal plants would typically be 35 to 40% at most. And also natural gas has a lower carbon intensity. There's a lower amount of emissions released for every unit of energy produced compared with those fuels. And then we've seen a significant rise in wind energy. So as you mentioned, last year we achieved 43%. I mean, 20 years ago it would have been about maybe 5%, if even that, 5% probably in total, of which 2 or 3 came from hydro. Yeah. So we've seen significant changes there. Building regulations is another place where we've made improvements, and the new buildings, the new houses being built have a much lower carbon footprint than houses built previously. Of course, one of the challenges there is we had the housing boom, and it was almost just after that these new building regs kicked in, when we weren't building houses anymore. So we have a legacy stock problem. And we changed the way new cars are taxed, and we changed annual motor tax away from, this was in 2008, away from the engine size to the carbon intensity. And again, that actually caused a shift in purchasing trends. Now, what we didn't anticipate or acknowledge at the time as well is that some of the car manufacturers were playing with the systems that were in place. And so we didn't get the emissions benefit that we should have. But it did show us that policies can result in change. If you have a systemic, a good policy, a bit like the plastic bag tax or the smoking ban, there are some policies that can be very effective. There are other policies that are more invisible but also can be effective. Like we've gradually increased the amount of biofuels we've blended with petrol and diesel. And that saves about 500,000 tonnes of CO2 emissions each year. And largely that's something we're not, you go into a petrol station, it's written on the petrol pump, E5, so 5% of the petrol is from ethanol, from a renewable source. But it's not very, very visible to us. So those are areas where we've seen change taking place. But if you look at the overall picture, our emissions now in 2019, for example, were 11% higher than in 1990. And if you look across the EU, in that same time period, there was about a 25% reduction in emissions.
So we've gone up.
We've gone up.
They've gone down 25.
Yeah. So so that's a huge challenge. Now, partly that is related to where we were in 1990. Of course, it's as a reference year, we were still largely moving from an agricultural-based to a services-based economy in that period. So
I think there was an Economist magazine title page that referred to Ireland as the poorest of the rich.
Yes.
At that time.
Yes.
So we've had a trajectory since then.
Correct. But some of the areas then that we've so that growth in emissions is a huge problem, and also as the audience correctly mostly identified, we've only 12% of our energy coming from renewable sources.
Yeah.
So that means we've 88% of our energy coming from fossil fuels, and that suggests we're not on target. Like our target for our mandatory target for renewable energy for last year was to get to 16% of our energy from renewable sources. Yeah. So because we only got to 12%, effectively that forces us to buy credits from other countries who've done well. Interestingly, now we're facing into a situation of change. Like in the last 3 years, the political leadership statements and ambition on renewables and emissions reduction has changed radically. And we have this new climate legislation that was legislated for only a couple of months ago. We had 108 of the TDs voting for it. I think the penny hasn't dropped still in terms of what's required to deliver on it. But we have a target now to reduce our emissions by 50% between now and 2030. That's matched in the world only by Denmark. So in terms of ambition, we've gone from this number I mentioned earlier. Between 1990 and 2019, our emissions grew by 11%. Now we have a target to drop them by 50% in a decade. It's a phenomenal positive step in terms of political ambition, but it needs to be matched then with the supports, and there's carrots and sticks that's required. Right. There's acknowledging inequalities that's required. There's a huge funding requirement, and right across the system in terms of government departments, local authorities, there's huge changes required. Yeah. It also requires, of course, societal engagement with it.
You're kind of getting into now about how what makes it difficult to change or why it's taking so long. You referenced the smoking ban, the plastic bag levy is a really good example. Like these were things that it appeared that maybe I'm sitting on the outside of it, but it appeared that reasonably quickly the policymakers decided there was or recognized there was a problem and decided to change. Why is this so hard? Why is it like the Earth Summit was in Rio in, I think, 1992?
Correct.
And that was when world leaders were all brought into this
Yep.
understanding of climate change is real. You know,
Yeah.
people have been, there's been a fairly solid recognition since the early 90s, even earlier,
Yeah.
that climate change is real. Why is it taking this long? What makes it so hard?
I think in many ways there was and still is an over-reliance on individual action. So you can see a parallel then with smoking. Like, we knew smoking was harmful for many years, and it was very late on in that time period that we introduced the ban in public places of smoking. We knew that plastic bags were problematic for many years, and then, you know, we introduced the levy. So it was almost like up until that period, you're expecting people to make changes where the system doesn't actually readily facilitate that change. Right. If you want to make those changes and do the right thing, you're an outlier. You're a pioneer.
It was essentially hard for you to do the right thing, whereas with these changes, it's hard for you not to do the right thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and it shows the role of the critical role that policy plays in actually setting the rules so that it's actually easy to move in the right direction, rather than it being blocked, essentially, you know. Mm-hmm. Now, there's huge system inertia across all the, you know, in terms of our heating systems, our power system. I hate to say it, within engineers, you know, within lots of different disciplines, there are significant levels of inertia. I think the fascinating thing is what the pandemic has shown us. Like this 51% target that we have over 10 years ago. 18 months ago, I would have said there's no hope. There's no way. That's not achievable. I think the pandemic has redefined the word achievability. Mm-hmm. Policies were introduced that would never have been considered outside of a pandemic context. It was treated like an emergency, the pandemic, correctly. And the other thing that was quite interesting was you saw policy listening closely to the science, and then policy giving mostly clear messages to society, to wider society, and putting in place the policy infrastructure to enable the changes that were required to respond to the pandemic. And if you look at how Ireland fared compared to, say, the US or the UK, where you didn't have that level of coherence, we fared much better. And it's really about, to me, taking the learnings of that and seeing what we can apply to climate change. Because climate change, we declared a climate emergency in our Dáil in 2014, I believe. It might have been a bit later. But that's, you know, there's been no signs of it being treated like an emergency. Right. So I think it's very interesting now. As I say, over the last 3 years, we've seen a significant change in political leadership. So how that will translate down. So the Climate Action Plan, which is due to be published this autumn, that will be very telling to see, is it actually showing the kind of changes from a policy perspective that are required to send the signals to the public that this is real.
Right. You know, I think when you drew the comparison with COVID there, it was very interesting. You talked about policymakers listening to the scientists and giving generally clear signals to the public. Where has there been is this chain working on the decarbonisation, climate change, renewable side? Is it that policymakers haven't listened to the scientists? Are the scientists giving a clear message to the policymakers? Or is it the policymakers haven't given clear instructions to the population? Where if you were to say there's the same chain there, where has that chain sort of not been functioning right?
That's a great question. I think the part of the challenge, I think, is that addressing climate change is more complex. Because if you like, the the pandemic was, we needed to find a cure, we needed to find a vaccine.
It's an instantly recognizable goal there.
Yeah, there's an immediacy. And there's a sense now that we have, to a certain extent, I mean, we failed miserably in terms of making that vaccine accessible internationally. But in terms of the solution set is kind of clear. With climate change, it's much more systemic. We need to change fundamentally things that we do, and not just for 18 months, but over a much different period. And some of those changes can happen quickly. We've seen that in electricity supply, because you're feeding something else into the electricity network. So what we use at the other end hasn't needed to change for that to happen. Whereas if we're talking about changing our buildings, like sometimes retrofitting our homes is talked about in a very simplified way, because it is a key part of the solution. And now there's an ambition over the next number of years to retrofit up to 1 million homes. But that requires 1 million individual family decisions.
Right.
So it's not something that can be tweaked easily. It's something that requires a much more societal engagement, societal activity. We had some very interesting research with some energy community groups a few years ago, and one of the things that came from people in local areas, this was in Tipperary, and they were trying to arrange retrofitting for a number of homes, get the suppliers to get the price down, by signing up a larger number of homes. And one of the things they said to me was that it's really difficult for us. We're trying our best to do this, and we don't hear any political leadership voices talking about climate action. So that part has changed now in terms of that, which is great.
Yeah.
We're working on a project now on the Dingle Peninsula where we're helping that rural energy community to find their path to a low carbon future, understand how people interact with new technologies like solar panels, heat pumps, batteries, electric vehicles. How are they discussing it with their neighbours? What are the problems they're finding? And then communicating those problems back to where the systemic challenges are. So it might be the ESB networks need to change what they're doing. It might be that the Commission for the Regulation of Utilities need to allow certain changes in markets. So it's very much looking at what's required from the community up, if you like.
It sounds maybe like that the chain involved is very, very complex.
Correct.
Just given the role that energy plays in our society, given how many different ways we use it and what it means to different people, there are many, many more stakeholders involved.
Correct.
And very, very interesting. I'm conscious that we have got the title Renewable Energy in our talk here. And we've been talking about energy in general.
Yes.
So what do you see as what could a renewable energy future for Ireland, not just for Dingle, for example, but for Ireland look like?
Well, we have huge, enviable wind resources. I mean, that's clear in terms of... I remember looking at it about 20 years ago. I was doing some calculations on wind energy, and you could get the same amount of electricity from one wind turbine in Ireland compared with 3 in Germany at the time.
Given our wind.
And given our wind, but also our subsidy structure, because in Germany they were very generous in terms of what they paid, so you could build things that were much more costly than we could build things here for. And there was arguments at the time that we were really scrimping too much on the price. But this was one of the comparisons that was kind of striking to me. So we have a huge wind resource. We've developed largely on land, and there's a huge untapped potential offshore. We also have huge capacity for bioenergy. We're great at growing grass in Ireland, for example, and that's one of the reasons our dairy industry is flourishing. But we could use gas to generate renewable. We could use grass to generate renewable gas and feed that into our gas system rather than the natural gas.
And similar to the renewable electricity, the end product
Yes.
would be no different.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So people wouldn't necessarily see any difference. They'd be turning on their gas cooker, but what's coming through is renewable gas. So it makes it more seamless. And renewable fuels then feeding into the liquid fuels, oil and diesel, as we're doing. Part of the challenge is that there's problems with all of these. I mean, I find it interesting when I tweet something about renewable gas. People who are in favour of renewable gas will cheer me on, and then I might tweet something about wind energy, and then suddenly somebody who might be in favour of renewable gas but isn't happy about wind energy will the same. So, like I look across the whole system to look at where the solutions are. They all have their advantages and they all have their challenges. But essentially, if you look at like wind and bioenergy are key initial resources that we have. And then we have so much offshore wind energy. Another thing that's really developed recently, and of course you're involved in it yourself, is the conversion of that offshore wind energy to hydrogen. So that when the wind is blowing but we don't need the electricity at that particular time, or we need a gaseous fuel rather than electricity, we can convert that wind energy into hydrogen and then use the hydrogen. And these are where there are key opportunities for Ireland. Solar energy, the price has come down considerably, radically in the last number of years. Where I see the real advantage there for Ireland would probably be on the rooftop level, and so our building regulations are correctly, I think, encouraging solar electricity coming in on people's rooftops. They're the kind of, there are many other sources out there in terms of the short rotation forestry as another form of bioenergy, but really speaking, our wind and a combination of bioenergy resources, I think, are something that could displace our oil, gas, and peat that we have currently.
You had an early, you mentioned earlier in your career, you looked at wave energy.
Yes.
Is wave energy, tidal, are they in the equation for you?
They are. I suppose the ones I was focusing on there are the more immediate ones. Yeah. But what we're seeing, wave energy has had a checkered history in terms of financial support. The research funding has blown hot and cold. So what that has delayed, to my mind, the improvements that are required, the engineering improvements that are required. So wave energy and tidal energy are both, again, in an Irish context, we have huge capacity there. And what we need to do and are doing is more research to bring the prices down. There's some great work in NUIG on the tidal blade design with Air Composites, a company out in Spittal, and you can start to see then that combination or a collaboration between researchers and engineering companies, materials companies to find the solutions, if you like. Yeah,
for sure. For any Invern people in the audience, I'll apologise and say that Air Composites is in Invern. Not
sorry.
Next parish over. I'm sure they get on very well. But I guess, like, we've been talking about renewables now, and we're identifying a lot of this kind of the, if you like, the supply side.
Yes.
Now, it's been said. I think it's a great quote that the cheapest energy is the energy you don't need.
Yes.
How do we? And you mentioned retrofitting for houses, and we're aiming to have up close to 1 million this decade. How do you think the efficiency side of things will play out, or where do you see opportunities for energy efficiency?
I think it's essential. It's an essential part of the solution, and it's in many guises. So retrofitting homes effectively gives our homes a woolly jumper, so we don't need as much sort of heating energy, because effectively we're containing the heat within the home. And that's one form of efficiency. Another form of efficiency is trying to switch from individual private cars to public transport, because you're if you have greater capacity and a better functioning public transport system, we're getting around from A to B in a much more efficient way. Then there's individual devices. Televisions is a good example. When we went from the cathode ray tube to the plasma screen to LCD screens, and they've really done a lot of work on improving the energy efficiency of, making sure the visual impact, what we need to get from the television we get, the utility of it we get, but at reduced energy usage. So there's individual device efficiency, there's individual home and building efficiency, and then there's more systemic changes, particularly in transport. You'd see the usefulness there. And another part of what needs to change is the smartness of our systems. So
smartness.
Yeah. So for example, with our high voltage power lines and the information coming from wind farms and from large generators, that's all very well centrally controlled through what's called SCADA systems. So we have good information transfer, and we know in real time what's happening. At the distribution level, we don't know. So when we were down on as we are working on the Dingle Peninsula, trying to see, well, if we have a number of electric vehicles on the peninsula, what impact are they having on the local power system? So we need to put in, and have put in more sensors on the local power system to actually be able to get greater sense of what's happening. And the smart meters is another element of that, to have to be able to make the systems more efficient, and also to avoid any kind of negative impacts, and to be able to turn the dials more easily, or allow things like if somebody has solar panels on their roof and they don't need electricity, and a neighbor down the road needs electricity at that particular point, to be able to have the systems to seamlessly allow that to be used. So that's what I mean by smartness. Sure. It lends itself not only to the efficiency piece, but also integrating greater amounts of renewables.
I'd like to ask you about, we've talked about a number of solutions here, and I've sort of haven't decided the proper way to ask this question, so I'm going to ask you kind of the same question in two different ways, and you can choose which way you want to answer it. So how renewable do you think we can get, is one way of putting it.
Yep.
The other way of putting it is, should renewable be a goal in itself, or should zero carbon be a goal in itself? And that maybe opens the door to other things beyond renewables, but that are zero carbon. So what do you think of this, of can we get 100% renewable? Is that desirable?
I certainly think we can. On the electricity side, reflecting back on Northern Crusher, we've already done it, and the challenge is to well, it would be a challenge to make the electricity system 100% renewable, but we're on track to doing that. We're currently at 40. We have an ambition for 2030 to raise that to 70. That's likely to go up to 80, I think, in the short term. And and part of that is an engineering challenge to make sure the lights stay on while we're integrating this increasing amounts of renewable electricity. The bigger challenge, I think, will be in terms of making the heating and transport 100% renewable. The short answer is we can do it, and we've done some analysis on what it might look like in 2050. So with that as a goal to get to 100% renewable energy by 2050. But it requires huge effort across the board, and particularly system-wide change. The second part of the question is, should that be the goal, is a great question. My own sense is that we should be more focused on zero carbon than 100% renewable.
So what would be the difference between the two?
And the difference would be, typically when you start looking at 100% renewable, again, it's the electricity picture dominates, so wind and solar come into their own. When you look at zero emissions, you start to see other options coming through. So, for example, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, that can come into 100% renewable, but it generally won't as readily as when you start focusing on zero carbon.
And is that because of cost or?
It's more because of, I suppose, the technologies you look at, what your goal is, and whether you're looking to meet that goal as cheaply as possible, or whether there's other criteria that you're exploring. So carbon capture and storage is where you trap the carbon dioxide. It's like imagining putting a bag over the chimney and capturing the carbon dioxide and then burying it into the ground. There's also the option of nuclear energy, which is a very contentious one. And different countries have different perspectives on nuclear energy. There are, in terms of from an engineering perspective, one of the key challenges we've had is that nuclear power plants are generally too big for the size of our network. But that's changing with the emergence of pebble bed reactors, which can be built at smaller scale. But this is one of the actual key challenges with the discussion, that for some people, some parts, some technologies are acceptable and others are not acceptable. So, so bioenergy is unacceptable to some, acceptable to others. Bioenergy itself, actually, of course, is a broad church, because there's a huge amount of different feedstocks in there. There's a huge amount of technologies used. It can be liquid, it can be gaseous, it can be solid. Wind energy is another one that some people don't like in terms of the visual impact, depending on how close they are, the sense of the noise impact. So this is really challenging, actually, and of course nuclear, as I mentioned, is very contentious for lots of reasons, largely associated with the waste side of things, but also maybe more so previously the link to the nuclear arms race. Sure. And this is why I suppose we call it a wicked problem, in the sense that there are so many moving parts, there are so many pieces of the jigsaw, some of which are more acceptable to some than others. Yeah. And this is what makes it very challenging. But there are a number of options, which is great. You know, now if we, there are no silver bullets, but there are a range of options. There are a canvas of options. So what that means is we can sort of choose to exclude some, but if we start excluding too many, we won't get there.
Right. You mentioned during your answer there about the phrase "keeping the lights on."
Yes.
And I guess that's one that sort of, when you see, you know, we've had some of these amber alerts.
Yes.
I understand we've had, which are these warnings coming from the power system that the balance between supply and demand of power is getting very, very tight.
Yeah.
We've had apparently maybe 11 of these in the last year.
Yeah.
We had 2 in the previous 10 years.
Yeah.
So I guess this is kind of getting to my question. Do we have to settle for less in a renewable future? Will we have to, you know, make do with brownouts, make do with losing power sometimes, or make do with tweeting less sometimes?
I think that's a great question, and it's very topical at the moment, because there is a growing concern about potential blackouts or brownouts in this winter. And it's linked to the fact, as I mentioned, like over the last 20 years, we've reduced the amount of fossil fuel generation, reduced the amount of emissions while increasing electricity demand. And I did mention that one of the parts of the solution in the future is to use more electricity for things we don't use electricity for currently, like transport and heating. We also have a particular step change in electricity usage that we're experiencing associated with data centers. And this is linked to the need for cloud services to enable what we're doing. You know, the video streaming is a big one, but that's only one example of the things we're doing that requires significant data flows, data storage, and those data centers are very power hungry. Our electricity network operator has done a phenomenal job. Like we have an island network, so we don't have the same advantages as they'd have in Denmark and Germany, where their power system for those countries is directly linked in, you know, minute by minute to the second by second to a much bigger power system. So they have a much bigger cushion than we have. We do have interconnection to the UK, but we have our power system, our synchronous power system, is just the island. So we have particular challenges, and our network operators have done a fabulous job in keeping the lights on while we've made those achievements. The challenge this winter is we have this growth in data centers. We have but we've 2 large gas power plants that are offline at the moment. And normally speaking, they would have been fixed during the COVID period, you know, and so they've been delayed. So there really is a critical need to get those back online. If they come back online, that kind of helps us to a certain extent. The other thing that we need to very urgently do is have more demand response. To your point about, it's not so much, in that case, maybe not so much settling for less, but settling for different times at which the electricity is available for different customers. And a lot of our usages for electricity would enable that. Not so readily in households. Obviously, when you turn the light on, you want it to come on. But refrigeration and some types of water pumping, there are certain things that can be staggered. And this links back to the question of smartness of the system, to be able to tweak these things. The question of must we settle for less, though, I think is a broader question, because I do think in addition to efficiency, in addition to renewable energy, we do need to have a serious question about consumption. And this is really challenging because it's quite...
Sorry, Brian. Do you mean consumption of energy or consumption of material goods, or are you being specific or broad here?
Well, consumption of energy, which means then consumption of material goods, because like we've kind of increasingly moved to fast food, fast clothes. You know, become a consumerist turnover society, which is wasteful of materials, but it's hugely energy intensive, and this is a big question, a big societal question, because if you like, there's a techno-optimistic approach that's sometimes discussed in terms of solving the climate change problem, where we can find technical solutions, and we are doing that. And in some respects, where that becomes techno-optimism is when you see that that's all that's required, almost, that we can still have our lifestyles as we have them, and find tech, and it's very attractive, of course.
I think, especially for engineers, we always assume that other engineers will find solutions.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think because of the scale of the reduction we're talking about, the scale of the challenge, that's not sufficient, in my view. And this raises questions about economic growth, because there's an automatic correlation that economists would have with productivity, economic growth, well-being. But there are alternative schools of thought that, like, what is the fundamental thing we're striving for? Is it happiness? And where does that bring us in terms of consumerism? But these are big questions, and much more challenging questions, and again require much more societal-wide dialogue.
I believe there's one country in the world places gross national happiness as a director of government policy. I believe it's Bhutan.
Okay.
But it's interesting that it is literally now. It's a kingdom, I believe. I don't believe there's a kind of a democratic side to that government. But it's interesting that happiness features explicitly in only one country's plans, whereas the rest of us operate mostly, I believe, on GDP.
Yes.
Which
is assumed to bring happiness.
Which is assumed to bring happiness. Material goods apparently bring happiness.
Yeah.
So okay, that's very interesting. Like, is there? We talk a lot about the cost of decarbonization, and we're sort of touching on that with our, could we make do without these material goods? But what are the benefits? Well, it seems that it's only a one-sided story, and that those who are promoting decarbonization, lower material use, greater efficiency, they're painted as being, if there's money, there's money given to them for their purposes, rather than money invested in something that could bring about benefits. What do you think are the benefits?
Well, if you look at renewable sources of energy, they're mostly indigenous to Ireland. They're mostly in rural areas. So there's a huge linkage there between rural development and renewable energy development. And at the moment, 80% of our energy is imported. So effectively, we're paying to import energy from. So the jobs are generated elsewhere, if you like, in terms of where that energy is extracted and delivered to us. The health benefits are immense. It's estimated 1,300 people a year die from air pollution, mostly associated with residential solid fuel burning.
Really? 1,300 people a year?
Yes.
Air pollution?
Yeah.
Mostly from solid fuel burning? Okay.
There's wider air pollution effects due to diesel transport, and that. So in it, I mean, the 1,300 is deaths, but there's a lot of illnesses, respiratory, etc. And of course, it affects people who are more vulnerable members of society more so.
And it probably affects decisions as well that people would make. Like certainly in the pre-pandemic times, I would cycle to work every day, and getting behind a bus, or a truck, I'd be fixated on the exhaust pipe, wondering, and this is before we were wearing masks and thinking of these things. But I'm sure there's many people would choose not to expose themselves to that. Get in the car, filtered air conditioning.
So in terms of the health impacts, and then there's well-being. I mean, it's interesting. In Paris, they've made a decision to remove half the car parking spaces in Paris, and they've spent a number of years then trying to have dialogue processes to see what should replace them. So with the citizens of Paris. You see in Vienna as well a very significant shift away from cities being a sort of a place where cars can get around, to cities being a place where citizens can enjoy life. And so there's huge benefits in terms of the reduced pollution, the reduced environmental impacts, but also then the socioeconomic and the well-being impacts. I mean, with transportation, for example, and we've seen it during the pandemic, this increase of walking and cycling and the added benefits of that, not just in terms of health, but in terms of people's well-being. So you're right. The focus of the discussion a lot of times is on the costs, and we don't talk enough about the opportunities.
Yeah, I think COVID has given us a little snapshot into what public spaces could be like.
Correct. Even
in a very temporary looking way. I had dinner in Salt Hill on the street, which would normally be car parking spaces, a couple of weeks ago, and it was just wonderful. And it would be amazing if one of the good things we could take away from COVID is this rethinking public space for people's benefit, and moving beyond the idea of cities being about cars' convenience. But
exactly.
Interesting. Maybe we could take something from COVID.
One of the interesting things in the Dingle Peninsula, one of our partners down there is the Dingle Hub, which was set up to support rural development, remote working, so people didn't have to move from Dingle into one of the bigger cities to work, and had the capacity to work from the town, and then live on the peninsula, continue to live on the peninsula. And there are plans to have more of these rural development hubs around Ireland, but through the project we've been engaging with them on, they've connected that rural development with climate action. So suddenly you have this opportunity to link rural and community development with climate action. The new opportunities that brings and the benefits in terms of, again, well-being, health, etc.
Yeah. Just one sec. Katrina, I've got loads more questions I want to ask Brian, but I want to bring the audience into this too. How are we doing for time? The time is 12:35. Oh, really? Okay, well, in that case... We have another session coming up at 2. Okay. Well, I would like to stay quiet for a while, and I would like to offer our audience members the chance. Just stick your hand up. Yes, question here. Okay, we have a microphone coming around somewhere. It will be delivered to you. Yeah, so it's this man on this side in the grey.
About the future of aviation. I mean, you talked about having to settle for less, and we've all settled for less over COVID, and we haven't been flying anywhere. Is that something we have to prepare ourselves for, or is there some technological solution on the horizon that's going to make it good for us all to travel on zero-carbon airplanes?
Excellent. Great question. Yeah, I think there's a couple of things we're seeing in that. I think it's in France. They've restricted flights within a certain distance. So you can see opportunities on the continent for increased train travel, for example. In Ireland, of course, because we're an island, we have specific challenges in terms of the other options that are available to us other than aviation. And the benefits that brings in terms of the connectivity and how it's opened Ireland up in terms of for others to come and visit us and for us to travel elsewhere. So I think what we'll see is a twin track approach where there will be efforts to reduce consumption, reduce air transport, particularly where there are other options available. And linked to this question, depending on how this question goes of consumption generally. And then in parallel, we will be and are researching fuel options. I mean, there are drop-in, renewable kerosene. So there are fuels available that can be used to displace fossil-based kerosene. One of the challenges here then is in terms of the policy framework isn't really there. Typically aviation fuels are left out of the national inventories and the national policy focus. And the aviation industry hasn't really been pioneering in terms of decarbonisation. They have made significant efforts to reduce the efficiency to increase the efficiency of planes because fuel is such a big cost in terms of the cost of flying. So there have been very significant improvements. So aviation is much more efficient than it was 20 years ago, but there's so much more of it now that it's causing more emissions. So I think there are two parts to it. One will be and there's renewable liquid fuels, and also talk about in terms of hydrogen as an option as well, or a liquefied form maybe of hydrogen. And I think what we're going to see is a significant increase in research and activity in that space, because otherwise it'll come to the point where the other will start to pinch more, the constraints, the regulation to reduce it. And that interplay is always tricky. As I say, it hasn't been sufficient to date to really get things going, even though there are fuels available to ensure that they're used more. So I think there'll be a twin dialogue on that one, and different solutions for different regions depending on the other alternatives available.
Another question. There's a man here in the kind of middle back.
What's the percentage of industrial use of energy vis-a-vis
Okay. Okay.
We might capture a few questions actually before.
Yeah. There's yeah.
I'm just wondering what the percentage use of industrial energy vis-a-vis personal use of energy.
Great.
Yeah.
And we'll take the lady's question here beside as well, and then we'll do two answers.
Do you want to answer his question
No,
first?
we'll take yours and then we'll do both.
One thing I've always been fascinated in is the difference between the actual temperature and the felt temperature, you know, based on the wind chill and all of that. And because Ireland is so wet and windy, do we use more energy to heat our houses because of this perceived coldness as opposed to the Europeans at the same temperature level? And is there research in Ireland for that unique kind of housing dilemma we have because of that kind of the felt temperature? And more in terms of retrofitting than in new, because I know heat exchangers work, but I mean our biggest problem is the current stock and what Irish research has gone into our situation.
Two great questions. Thanks very much. In terms of industrial energy use in Ireland, it would be lower than residential energy use. We're a bit of an outlier there compared to other European countries because we don't have as much heavy industry. We used to have like Carman Ford in Cork and the steel plant, but they're largely gone. And most of our industrial activity is in food and beverage, ICT, computers and technology, and pharmaceuticals. And they generally would not be as energy intensive as things we would have done previously, such as manufacturing clothes, steel, etc. So our industry energy use would be, from recollection, it's about 18% of our energy use is in industry, and the residential is about 25%. It's of that order. Great question on we have a problem with dampness and humidity and wind chill. So all of those things do impact in our experience, if you like, of temperature difference. But the biggest reason I think that we're outliers relative to other EU countries is that we allowed houses be built that weren't very energy efficient, that weren't as cozy, if you like. And in some respects, because of our mild climate, that was kind of, it didn't really, our experience wasn't impacted too much, but it did impact it does impact on the energy use. We also have a lot of one-off houses, so then you've got more exposure because there's more of the surface of the home that's exposed to the elements. So that's another factor that's kind of different in the Irish context. So I think our residential emissions per household would be, from recollection, it's about 20% higher than the EU average.
So with all this in mind, oh, sorry, I see one last question. We'll take one last question from the audience.
I just wanted to come back into the consumption discussion that we had there before. You mentioned consumption, and that might be actually the basis of all our troubles on this planet, seeing that we're coming too close to carrying capacity, and as opposed to planetary systems are showing us that we overstepped the mark in terms of natural resource consumption and also waste production at this stage in terms of the biodiversity issues that are there and the crisis on the biodiversity front. So in terms of the real kind of problem that I see, and you mentioned that COVID showed us that when we identify an issue, that we could all on a global scale get together and do something about it. But it seems like the consumption is actually, it's us that is the issue, and the systems that are involved, the global economic systems that are involved with the consumption that we as humans are now doing, and the resulting negative impacts on the whole planetary system. So just maybe more on the consumption side.
Can you comment on that in 1.5 minutes?
Well, again, I think the interesting discussion around consumption is how much of it is individual and how much of it is systemic. And I would think it's both. Another challenge when we talk about consumption is how it impacts on people who are at a different level of consumption that's increasing. Be that in Ireland, so people who are experiencing poverty, for example, are we telling them you can't consume more? And then internationally as well, you've got north-south issues internationally. So that's why I think it's very complex. But I would be more concerned about the systemic, I think the systemic causes of consumption rather than individual, because again, there's a danger of getting into blame games and stuff, and I think really the systems are where we can, where we should focus, the economic systems and the production systems and the availability systems, if that makes sense.
Will we succeed in decarbonising?
Well, we can. Whether we will or not, I think the next year will be very telling in terms of how serious the policies are and how serious the engagement is. I think the next year will be, in terms of our target for 2030, I think when the penny drops, which I hope it will soon, so in the next year, so maybe ask that of the person next year, or if there is a, this next year, this coming year, I think will be critical, because the other thing is we've just passed through COVID, and the learnings, if we have any opportunity to draw those learnings into other areas, it's in the next year. The political decision to go for such a significant ambition has just happened in the last couple of months. So again, in the next year, it'll be telling as to whether we can. I would hope we will. I remain to be convinced we certainly can, but I haven't seen certainly enough momentum yet to say we will.
Okay, but there is hope.
But there is hope.
Professor Brian O'Gallagher, thanks very much.
Thank you, Rory. Thank you.